a drought.
Wildfires sweep Europe.
Hottest day ever recorded.
Crops fail across 3 continents.
Unprecedented, they said.
Scientists warn of record-breaking heat.
Reservoirs at historic lows. Nothing like this has happened before.
Between 1876 and 1878, tens of millions of people starved to death. Not in one country, in India, in northern China, in northeastern Brazil, in Ethiopia, all at once. None of them knew that the same ocean was killing every one of them. Today you check your phone, and a forecast tells you what El Niño will do weeks, months, even years before it does it. In 1877, no one on Earth had a name for the force that took the rain away. This is what the world looked like when a single ocean decided, for 3 straight years, who would eat and who would not. In the backcountry of Ceará, in the northeast corner of Brazil, a family of sertanejos had a cistern behind their mud-walled house. The father had spent his whole life watching that cistern, the way a sailor watches the horizon. Every dry season, the water dropped. Every rainy season, it filled back up. That was the rhythm. The cistern was the rhythm. The whole architecture of the homestead, the thick mud walls to hold out the worst of the heat, the low roof that caught what breeze there was, the door facing away from the midday sun, was an answer to the question of how to live in a place where rain might not come for a year, or 2, or 3. In 1877, the rains did not come. November passed, December passed, the sky stayed the color of bleached bone, and the cistern kept dropping. By February, the family was scooping the last bucketfuls for the cattle. The cattle died first. That is the order in a sertão drought. The animals go, then the small reservoirs, then the cassava bran, then the inner bark of the caatinga trees. The people who survived long enough to remember it later would tell you what they ate, because what they ate is what defined the years 1877 and 1878 in the memory of the Nordeste. A grandmother boiled strips of bark and squeezed the liquid through a cloth. A child gnawed on the soft pulp of the cactus mandacaro, which is mostly water and a thin, bitter flesh that fills the belly without feeding it. The men went further into the brush, looking for anything that moved. A lizard, a root, the carcass of an animal that had died days before. There is a name for this in Portuguese, fome grande, the great hunger, and in 1877, the sertão of Ceará was eating the only thing left in a landscape with nothing left. By April, the cistern had cracked. The family packed what they could carry and joined the road. The road had a name too, retirantes. They were the people who retreated, from the interior toward the coast, toward Fortaleza, toward the ports, toward the Amazon. In some weeks, the columns of walking families stretched for kilometers along the dust, with the small children riding on the adults' shoulders because they could no longer walk, and the very old being carried in hammocks until there was no one left strong enough to carry them. The dogs had gone first, into the brush to eat whatever they could find. The vultures had moved on, the dead too scattered, the living too thin to keep their attention. In some accounts from survivors, the road itself became a kind of geography. There were places where the columns stopped for water that wasn't there. There were places where the bodies lay where they had been set down the day before because there was no one to bury them. There were children who had stopped walking and sat down in the shade of a rock that offered no shade because stopping felt like a thing the body was allowed to do. The state of Ceará had a relief system on paper. It did not have the food. Estimates of the dead vary, but the careful demographic work of the period puts the death toll in Ceará alone at around 175,000. By the end of 1878, with roughly 500,000 dead across the broader Nordeste, 3 million people fled the region. Of those who survived, around 55,000 eventually made it into the Amazon basin along a corridor that had not existed before the drought, and that, once the rains returned, became one of the great internal migrations in Brazilian history. The Grande Seca, the Great Drought, also built something quieter. A class of contractors, engineers, and political patrons whose livelihoods depended on the drought continuing. The dry Northeast became a place where someone, somewhere, always profited from someone else's thirst. What the Sertanejo family walking toward Fortaleza did not know, and could not have known, was that the same sky that refused to break over their heads was refusing to break, at almost the same moment, over the Deccan Plateau in India, and over the Loess highlands of northern China, and over the highlands of Ethiopia. They thought, naturally, that this was their curse, their dry corner of the world, their bad luck, their failing, their God's punishment. They were wrong. They were dying from someone else's ocean. In the second year of the failure on the Deccan Plateau, the southwest monsoon did something it had not done in living memory. It failed again. The Indian agricultural calendar was not a calendar in the European sense. It was the difference between eating and not eating. The Kharif crop, sown with the June rains, was supposed to feed a fifth of humanity through the dry months that followed. When the rains did not come in 1876, the crop simply did not exist. When they failed again in 1877, the population was already drawing on reserves that did not exist. The official Indian record of rainfall deficits from the period, reconstructed a century and a half later by climate scientists, would describe 1877 as roughly 3 standard deviations below normal, the worst single monsoon deficit on record. The villagers whose field sat empty under a white sky did not have the language of standard deviations. They had a different one. The year the rains did not come, the year after the year the rains did not come. Indian village life was built around the monsoon in ways that are hard to recover from this distance. Houses in the Deccan were oriented to catch whatever breeze there was. Granaries were sized to hold a single year's crop. Labor was hired by the season, and the seasonal rhythm was the rhythm of the rains. There was no other economy to fall back on when the rains failed, because the entire economy was the rains. The architecture of the fight against drought in India was not a fight at all. It was a bet placed every June that the sky would keep its promise. By the spring of 1877, in the Madras Presidency alone, the British Relief Administration had opened camps where the starving could exchange hard labor for a daily ration. The ration had been set in March of that year by the Viceroy's famine commissioner, Sir Richard Temple, at roughly 570 grams of grain and 43 grams of dal per adult per day. The amounts were deliberate. Temple and his advisors were disciples of the English political economist Thomas Malthus, and they believed sincerely that a ration set above bare subsistence would breed dependency. The ration was set below bare subsistence. That was the policy. The relief camps of Madras became, by summer, places where men, women, and children were put to work digging roads, breaking stones, and cutting earthworks in return for the food that kept them alive long enough to do another day's work. A worker who fell short of the daily digging quota had his ration cut. The weaker ones, the older ones, the ones whose bodies had already begun to fail, could not keep up. They were cut off the ration, and within days they were dead on the road outside the camp. In one account from a camp doctor, the dead lying by the gate in the morning were often the same people who had been at work the day before. The relief system, designed to be sustainable, was producing death at a rate that by autumn, the administrators in Calcutta could no longer ignore. By August, the camps had taken on a routine of their own. The workers rose before dawn and walked to the work site in silence because there was no energy left for talking. They dug until their arms gave out. The camp cook distributed the ration at midday in a single thin scoop of gruel that one survivor described as looking like dishwater. By evening, the line at the camp gate was shorter than it had been in the morning, and the camp doctor noted the names of those who had not come back from the day's work. The scale of the Indian famine was, and is, the largest single empire mortality event of the 19th century. Demographic work in the years since has settled on a range, with the most careful estimate at roughly 8.2 million dead across British-administered provinces, and broader counts by contemporary campaigners reaching close to 9.5 million. The area affected covered some 670,000 square kilometers. The official British export of grain from India during the famine years did not stop. Ships left Bombay harbor carrying wheat to Britain, while Indian peasants died by the rail line. The Indian peasant who died by the rail line in 1877, with the empty sky above him and the grain ships out beyond the breakwater, died thinking this was a failure of British policy, or a failure of rain, or a failure of his own small crop. He did not know that the same ocean that had killed the sertanejo walking toward Fortaleza had, on the other side of the planet, just opened its surface to the sun and held it there for a season. Northern China, the province of Shanxi, in the second winter of the drought. The missionary Timothy Richard traveled into the province in early 1878, and what he wrote in his diary is one of the few first-hand records of what the famine looked like in the Chinese interior. He had been warned before he set out that the villages between the provincial capitals had been emptying. He had not been warned how completely. Richard had walked into Shanxi from the south, following the Yellow River upstream, and then cutting west into the hill country where the villages grew thin. He walked for weeks. What he recorded, village by village, was a province that had held 100 households in 1876 and was down to 12 by 1879. The arithmetic of depopulation is not abstract when you walk through a Shanxi village in the second winter of a famine. The doors of the houses are open. The cooking fires have not been lit in months. The schoolhouse is shuttered. The only sounds are the wind and occasionally the sound of someone dragging themselves along a road that no longer leads anywhere useful. The famine had begun in the summer of 1876 in Henan and Shandong, then moved north and west into Shanxi and Jili. By the second winter, the death toll across the 5 northern provinces had crossed 9.5 million and would rise toward 13 million before the rains finally returned in 1879. Shanxi alone, by the most careful modern reconstruction, lost roughly 5.5 million people. The official Qing census recorded a population drop of around 23 million across the affected region, an underestimate, by the admission of the officials compiling it, of the actual loss. The Qing court, in the wake of the Great Taiping Rebellion, barely a decade after the suppression that had emptied its treasury and broken its administrative reach into the provinces, did not have the grain reserves or the logistical capacity to feed the north. The provincial authorities opened granaries that had been looted years before. They tried to move grain on roads that the rains, when they finally came in 1878, had washed into mud. They did not move enough. The Chinese farmer's survival arithmetic was not Temple's arithmetic. There was no relief ration designed below subsistence, because there was, for most peasants, no British-administered ration at all. The survival arithmetic was the family's arithmetic. A family that had a daughter of marriageable age might sell her, in a transaction that both parties understood as a way to keep the younger children alive for one more season. A family that had nothing left to sell might walk into a market town and not walk out. The record is full of men who lay down by the road in the second winter and did not get up. Richard, traveling through Shanxi in the spring of 1878, wrote of seeing children with limbs so thin that the bones showed through the skin, and of men and women who had eaten the bark off the trees within reach of the road. He recorded, without elaboration, that in some villages, the bodies of the dead had been left where they fell because there was no one left strong enough to carry them away. What the Chinese farmer who died on the road in 1878 did not know, and could not have known, was that the same sky that refused to break over his head was refusing to break, at almost the same moment, over a family walking the retirement road in Brazil, and over the relief camps of Madras, and over the highlands of Ethiopia, where a famine known as Kifukan would, in the next decade, kill up to 1/3 of the population. He died thinking this was a Chinese failure, a failure of dynasty, a failure of heaven. He was wrong, too. On the coast of Peru, for at least a generation or more before the first formal written reference appeared in 1892, fishermen had given a name to a current. It arrived around Christmas. It arrived warm. The anchovies that the fishermen relied on would vanish when it came, and the catch would collapse for weeks. The fishermen called the warm current El Niño, the child, the Christ child, because it arrived at the time of his festival. The first written description of the phenomenon appeared in 1892 in a paper read before the Geographical Society of Lima by Captain Camilo Carrillo of the Peruvian Navy. Carrillo had not invented the name. He was writing down a name that had been in coastal use for as long as anyone could remember. What he wrote down was the symptom: a warm current, a failed anchovy fishery. A change in the weather along the coast that in some years was so severe that the desert bloomed with grass, and the rivers ran where rivers had not run in living memory. In a fishing village north of Lima, an old man might have told Carrillo that his grandfather had called the same warm current by the same name, and that the grandfather had heard it from his own father. The naming tradition, by the time Carrillo wrote it down, was already old. What was new was that anyone with a pen had bothered to put it in a place where other people with pens might read it. In 1892, no one was connecting the Peruvian warm water to the Indian drought, to the Chinese famine, or to the deaths in Sertão. No one could have connected them. There was no mechanism known that would allow a stretch of ocean on one side of the planet to control the rain on the other. The very idea would have sounded like a fairy tale to a working meteorologist. The Peruvian fishermen knew the symptom. They knew it well enough to have named it, and to have adjusted their seasons around it. They had watched the desert bloom. They had watched the rivers run. They had watched the same warm current come back every few years around Christmas and break their livelihood for a season. They did not know that the warming they were watching arrive off their beaches was the surface expression of a planetary event. They did not know that the same warming was, in the same years, shutting down the monsoon over the Indian subcontinent, drying the low S of northern China, and emptying the cisterns of Ceará. The fishermen noticed something else too that took longer to register. In the years when El Niño came, the rains along the coast of Peru were heavier than usual. The desert would sprout briefly, with grass that the llamas could eat. The rivers, usually dry, would run down to the sea. To a people whose economy was built on a thin margin between the ocean and the desert, this sounded like a mercy. It was not a mercy. It was the weather responding to a warming that a continent away was killing fields that did not have to die. What they had named was the local fingerprint of a global fingerprint. They were watching the switch that ran the climate of the entire tropical belt, and they thought it was their own warm water. The naming matters. Naming a thing is the first move toward understanding a thing, and the Peruvian coast had, without realizing it, given the world the word that the world would eventually need. For now, though, the word sat in a Lima journal and waited. It would have to wait a long time. The famines of 1876 to 1878 were not parallel tragedies. They were one event. The Sertão family in Ceará, the relief camp worker in Madras, the peasant on the road in Shanxi were not being punished by separate droughts. They were being punished by the same drought, the same failed monsoon, the same missing sky, generated from the same band of warming water along the equatorial Pacific. The reconstruction of that ocean is now possible in a way it was not in 1877. Climate scientists have gone back through ship logs from the period, atmospheric pressure records from a handful of colonial observatories, and tree ring reconstructions to put numbers on the warming that did the damage. Somewhere along the equator, a ship's captain was recording sea surface temperatures far above what his logbook said they should be. The peak anomaly in the eastern equatorial Pacific in December of 1877 sat near 3 degrees Celsius above the seasonal average, a number that, in the modern era of El Niño forecasting, would trigger an emergency on every forecasting desk on Earth. What was happening at the level of the ocean and the atmosphere was not magic, and it was not a curse. It was a coupled system. The trade winds, which normally blow westward along the equator and pile warm water against the coasts of Indonesia and Australia, weakened. The warm water sloshed back east. The eastern Pacific, normally cool and rich with nutrients, warmed by several degrees. The atmospheric convection that normally sits over the western Pacific shifted east with the warm water. The rain belt that normally waters India and China shifted with it. India dried, China dried. The Nordeste dried. The fishermen of Peru saw the warm water arrive on their beaches. That was the El Niño part of the system. The pressure differences between the Indian and Pacific Oceans were tilting at the same moment. Two halves of the same planetary engine locked to each other, one ocean warming while another went quiet. The famines that followed the 1877 event were not the last. The same ocean system fired again between 1896 and 1900, hitting many of the same regions. Across these waves, the historian Mike Davis, in late Victorian holocausts, estimated the dead in the tens of millions, a toll that, at its upper end, approached 3% of everyone alive on Earth. And in 1900, in the Bombay Presidency, famine mortality reached the worst the region had seen in the entire Victorian era. These were not parallel tragedies. They were the same tragedy, hitting the planet again and again. The same equatorial band of ocean pulling the rain belt off course each time. The victims in 1877, in 1897, in 1900 never knew they were sharing the same force. It had no name they could use, no chart they could look at, no forecast they could plan around. They died from a single ocean they could not see. The first person to come close to understanding what was happening did not come close for another half-century. During his tenure at the India Meteorological Department, where he had served as Director General of Observatories since 1904. A British mathematician and meteorologist named Gilbert Walker spent years wading through pressure records from observatories across the tropics, trying to build a forecasting system for the Indian monsoon so that the next time the rains failed, the British administration would know in advance. What Walker found, when he finished, was a statistical pattern. When the atmospheric pressure over the Indian Ocean was high, the pressure over the Pacific was low, and vice versa. He called it the Southern Oscillation. It was a clean, repeatable, statistically robust signal. It also had no mechanism anyone could accept. Walker's contemporaries treated the discovery as a curiosity, a pattern in the data that for all anyone could tell was just a pattern. The connection between Walker's seesaw and the deaths of 1877 went unmade. The connection would not be made until 1969, when a Norwegian-American meteorologist named Jacob Bjerknes at UCLA published a paper that finally proposed the obvious, which no one had proposed for 90 years, that El Niño and the Southern Oscillation were the same phenomenon. The warm water off Peru and the pressure seesaw between the Indian and Pacific Oceans were not two events. They were one event, the surface and the atmosphere of a coupled ocean-atmosphere engine, feeding each other, locking into the same phase, and projecting their influence across the entire tropical belt and beyond. Bjerknes' 1969 paper did not arrive in time to save anyone in 1877. It did not arrive in time for the second wave in 1897 or the third in 1900. It arrived 92 years after the first of those famines and roughly 70 years after the last. The people who died from El Niño in the 19th century died from an El Niño that no one had named as a global system, from an ocean that no one had learned to look at. The mechanism that had starved them was understood finally, only when most of the people who had survived it were dead. The forecast you can pull up on your phone. The the one that shows the equatorial Pacific warming weeks before it shifts the global rain belt, exists because Walker noticed a seesaw in the early decades of the century, and because Bjerknes named the loop in 1969. Those two understandings, layered on each other, are the reason a weather forecaster in 2026 can warn a coastal city, or an Indian district, or a Brazilian state that a hungry year is coming, with weeks of lead time. The forecast is not magic. The forecast is a debt paid with 2 careers and 90 years of work, paid against a loss that had already been counted in bodies. The sertão family never made it to the Amazon. The grandmother died by the road outside Kishiramobim in the 3rd week of the retreat. The father walked for another month with the child on his shoulder until he could not. The cistern at the back of the mud-walled house cracked again in 1878, and again in 1879, and again in 1898, because the same ocean kept firing, and the architecture of the sertão was rebuilt every time the rains came back, and forgotten every time the rains came back. On your phone, right now, you can pull up a forecast that tells you what the equatorial Pacific is doing. You can see the warm band forming, or the cool one strengthening, weeks before it shifts the rain belt. You can warn the next Chara, the next Madras, the next Shanxi. The distance between those two facts, the family watching the sky and you checking the chart, is the distance between a world that starved not knowing why, and a world that knows because it finally learned how to look. The knowing was paid for in lives. The forecast is what we built with what we paid. If you have ever wondered why an app on your phone can warn half the planet about a storm that is still forming, this is what that warning was built on. Subscribe for more origin stories.